There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from being for too long. It's waking up and not wishing for anything bad to happen, just wishing the day didn't need you in it. Not sadness exactly, not despair in the dramatic sense, just a deep, steady fatigue that settles into the bones. People who are tired of existing still laugh, still work, still reply to messages. But inside, something keeps whispering, I don't want to do this anymore. Not life itself, just the endless maintenance of it. This story isn't about giving up. It's about understanding what happens when the mind carries weight for too long, and what it quietly asks for when it finally feels heavy enough to rest. There's a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't touch, because it isn't stored in the body. It lives somewhere deeper, behind the eyes, in the chest, in the space where motivation used to sit. People who are tired of existing don't always look like they're struggling. They get up. They answer emails. They show up to birthdays, meetings, conversations. From the outside, everything appears functional, even fine. But inside, there's a constant low-volume hum of exhaustion, like a machine that's been running for years without being turned off. This isn't the tiredness of a hard week. It's the fatigue of endless continuity. Day after day that requires attention, reaction, responsibility. An unspoken pressure to keep going, simply because stopping feels impossible. And that's what makes this exhaustion so confusing. There's no obvious disaster. No single moment to point to and say, that's when it broke. Instead, it's the accumulation of everything. Every expectation met, every emotion managed, every role performed. People describe it quietly, cautiously. I'm not depressed. I don't want to die. I just don't want to keep doing this like this. It's not a desire to disappear. It's a desire for relief from being required. Often, this exhaustion hides behind productivity, behind competence, behind being the reliable one, the strong one, the one who doesn't fall apart. Because somewhere along the way, survival became an identity, and rest became something to earn. So instead of collapsing, the mind adapts. It numbs. It distances. It goes through motions with practiced efficiency, while quietly withdrawing emotional investment from the future. Hope doesn't vanish dramatically. It thins. It stretches so far into the distance that it no longer feels reachable. Not because the person is pessimistic, but because imagining more of the same feels unbearable. This is where many people get stuck, believing their exhaustion means something is wrong with them, that they're ungrateful, weak, broken. After all, their life might look good enough. Other people have it worse. But exhaustion doesn't ask for comparison. It asks for honesty. And the honest truth is this. Humans were never designed to be constantly alert, constantly productive, constantly available, without periods of genuine restoration. When rest is postponed long enough, the mind doesn't scream, it whispers. It whispers through disengagement, through apathy, through the quiet thought, I don't want to do this anymore. Not life, just the version of life that feels endless and unforgiving. And that distinction matters. Because people who are tired of existing are often still deeply alive. They still feel beauty fleetingly. They still care, even when it hurts. They still notice small moments that soften them. Music, sunlight, a familiar voice. What they're exhausted by is not existence itself, but the weight of carrying it alone, without pause, without permission, without relief. This chapter isn't here to diagnose. It's here to recognize, to say, if this feels familiar, you're not failing at life. You're responding to prolonged strain. And before we ask how to fix it, before we rush toward solutions, the first thing that matters is naming it. This is not laziness, not ingratitude, not weakness. It's quiet exhaustion, and it deserves to be understood. This kind of exhaustion rarely appears out of nowhere. It grows. Slowly, quietly, often so gradually that by the time it's noticed, it already feels like part of who someone is. For many people, the roots begin early, not necessarily in trauma that leaves visible scars, but in long stretches of emotional responsibility. Being the one who had to grow up fast. The one who learned to self-soothe because no one else was available. The one who became easy, independent, or mature for their age. When a child learns that their needs are inconvenient, or that expressing emotion creates tension, they adapt in the only way they can by needing less, by asking for less, by caring more internally. And that pattern doesn't disappear with age. It just becomes more sophisticated. Over time, life adds layers. School, work, relationships, finances, identity. Each layer brings expectations, spoken and unspoken. And the person who learned early how to hold things together often becomes the one who keeps doing it. Not because they want to, but because they don't know how not to. Chronic stress plays a quiet role here. Not the dramatic kind that demands immediate action, but the constant background pressure of responsibility without relief. Bills that must be paid, roles that must be fulfilled, emotions that must be managed carefully. When stress becomes familiar, the nervous system stops signaling urgency and starts operating in endurance mode. Survival without recovery. For some, the origin is emotional neglect, not the absence of love, but the absence of attunement. Being cared for physically, yet unseen emotionally. Taught how to function, but not how to rest, feel, or receive support. Others trace it to perfectionism, a learned belief that worth is conditional, earned through performance, reliability, or usefulness. Rest then becomes guilt-ridden. Stillness feels unsafe. And then there are those whose exhaustion was shaped by loss. Unprocessed grief, sudden change, moments where the world proved unreliable and hypervigilance became necessary. What all these paths share is this: the self learned to stay alert, always scanning, always adjusting, always preparing for what might go wrong. At first, this adaptation is protective. It helps people succeed. It earns praise. It creates stability. But over years, the cost accumulates. Joy becomes something to schedule. Rest becomes something postponed. Presence becomes fragmented. Life turns into a series of tasks to complete rather than moments to inhabit. And eventually, something inside grows tired of carrying the weight alone. People often say, "Nothing that bad happened to me." But exhaustion isn't only born from catastrophe. It's born from duration, from being strong for too long, from holding things together without being held, from constantly adapting without being allowed to soften. The mind doesn't keep score in dramatic events, it tracks load. And when the load exceeds capacity for long enough, it doesn't collapse, it dims. This is why people reach adulthood feeling oddly hollow, even when their life looks stable. They didn't lose themselves suddenly, they slowly put themselves aside. Understanding where this began isn't about blame, it's about compassion. Because when we see that this exhaustion was learned, conditioned, and reinforced, we can stop treating it as a personal flaw. It was a strategy, one that worked until it didn't. And before healing can begin, it helps to see how long the mind has been trying to protect you, even at its own expense. When someone says they're tired of existing, the assumption is often emotional weakness, a lack of gratitude, or a negative mindset. But psychology tells a very different story. The human brain is not built for continuous demand without recovery. It thrives on rhythm, effort followed by rest, focus followed by release. When that rhythm is disrupted for too long, the brain doesn't rebel, it conserves. One of the first systems affected is the nervous system. Under chronic stress, it remains stuck in a heightened state of alert, a prolonged fight or flight response. Even when there's no immediate danger, the body behaves as if something is always about to go wrong. Heart rate stays elevated, muscles remain tense, sleep becomes shallow or fragmented, and the mind never fully powers down. Over time, this constant activation leads to nervous system exhaustion. The body can't stay alarmed forever, so it shifts into a quieter survival mode. This is where emotional numbness often appears. Not because someone doesn't care, but because the brain is trying to reduce sensory and emotional input to protect itself from overload. Another key player here is dopamine, the neurotransmitter linked to motivation, anticipation, and reward. Chronic stress and emotional strain blunt the brain's dopamine response. Activities that once felt meaningful now feel flat. Not painful, just empty. This is why people say things like, "I don't enjoy anything anymore," or "Nothing feels worth the effort." The brain isn't broken, it's depleted. Decision fatigue also compounds the problem. Every day requires choices: what to do, how to respond, who to be. When someone has spent years being hyper-responsible, their cognitive resources slowly erode. Even simple tasks begin to feel heavy. Not because they're difficult, but because the system making the decisions is worn down. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, when repeated exposure to stress without relief teaches the brain that effort doesn't change outcomes. Motivation drops, not as surrender, but as adaptation. The brain learns. Why expend energy if nothing truly eases the load? Importantly, this state often exists without clinical depression. People can still function, connect, and care, while internally feeling drained and disengaged. Burnout lives in this gray space. Not dramatic enough to be obvious, but persistent enough to reshape identity. And then there's emotional suppression. When feelings are consistently pushed aside to maintain stability or avoid conflict, the brain uses enormous energy to keep them contained. This internal pressure contributes to mental fatigue, even when life appears calm on the surface. Over time, the brain associates consciousness itself with effort. Being awake becomes work. Thinking becomes draining. Existing feels like a task that never ends. This is why rest alone often doesn't fix the problem. Sleep helps the body, but the mind remains burdened. Because the issue isn't energy, it's load. And until the load is addressed, expectations, self-pressure, emotional labor, unresolved stress, the brain stays in conservation mode. Understanding this changes the narrative. This exhaustion isn't a moral failing. It's not laziness. It's not a lack of resilience. It's a nervous system that has been asked to do too much for too long without safety, softness, or pause. And once we see this as a biological response, not a personal defect, something important shifts. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What has my brain been carrying all this time?" For many people, the hardest part of being tired of existing isn't the exhaustion itself, it's the guilt that follows it. A quiet inner voice begins to argue, "You shouldn't feel this way. Others have it worse. Be grateful. Just push through." So instead of listening to the exhaustion, they fight it. They force optimism. They stay busy. They distract themselves with noise, productivity, or constant stimulation. Anything to avoid sitting with the truth that something inside is deeply worn down. This resistance often comes from fear. Fear that acknowledging the exhaustion will make it permanent. Fear that if they stop pushing, everything will fall apart. Fear that rest will turn into collapse. And so the mind stays in control mode. People become experts at functioning on empty. They perform competence flawlessly. They smile automatically. They say, "I'm fine," without thinking. But internally, there's a growing tension between how they feel and how they believe they're supposed to feel. This creates a second layer of exhaustion, the effort of pretending. Many were taught, explicitly or subtly, that struggling is weakness, that needing help is burdening others, that emotional discomfort should be solved quickly, not explored. So when the fatigue shows up, it's treated like an enemy. People try to outthink it, outwork it, outrun it. Some numb it with constant scrolling, entertainment, or substances. Others intellectualize it, reading, analyzing, labeling, without allowing themselves to actually feel it. And some turn the exhaustion inward, concluding that the problem must be who they are. This is where shame enters. Shame says, "If I were stronger, I wouldn't feel this way. If I were more disciplined, more positive, more grateful." But shame misunderstands the signal, because this exhaustion isn't asking to be defeated. It's asking to be acknowledged. The more it's resisted, the louder it becomes, not through panic, but through withdrawal. People begin disengaging emotionally. They stop imagining the future. They avoid decisions that require hope. They live smaller, safer lives to conserve what little energy remains. Yet even here, resistance continues. They criticize themselves for not wanting more, for not being ambitious enough, for not feeling excited about things they're supposed to want. This internal conflict drains enormous energy. One part of the self is pleading for rest, relief, or change. Another part insists on endurance at all costs. And the body sits in the middle, holding the tension. Often, people don't realize how hard they're fighting themselves. They believe they're battling circumstances, when in reality, they're resisting their own limits. This is why exhaustion can feel endless. Not because there's no way out, but because the mind refuses to stop pushing long enough to hear what the fatigue is trying to say. There's a painful irony here. The traits that once helped someone survive, strength, reliability, independence, become the very things preventing relief. Letting go feels dangerous. Softening feels irresponsible. Admitting, "I can't do this anymore," feels like failure. But exhaustion doesn't respond to force. It responds to permission. And the turning point begins not when someone pushes harder, but when they finally stop arguing with how tired they are. The turning point rarely arrives as a dramatic moment. There's no sudden clarity, no life-altering decision made overnight. It's quieter than that. Often, it begins with a simple thought, almost whispered beneath the exhaustion. Maybe this isn't about giving up. For the first time, the question shifts. Not what's wrong with me, but what is this feeling trying to tell me? This is where resistance softens. Instead of immediately pushing the fatigue away, there's a pause, a breath, a willingness to listen. And what emerges isn't a desire to disappear. It's a longing for relief, space, and honesty. People begin to realize that being tired of existing doesn't mean they want life to end. It means they want this version of living to change. The endless pressure, the self-erasure, the constant readiness to perform. This realization reframes everything. The exhaustion becomes a signal, not of failure, but of misalignment. A signal that the nervous system has been in overdrive for too long, that boundaries have been crossed repeatedly, that needs have gone unacknowledged. For many, this is the first time they allow themselves to name what they don't want anymore. I don't want to live in constant urgency. I don't want to measure my worth by productivity. I don't want to feel responsible for everyone else's emotions. Naming these truths feels both relieving and frightening. Relieving, because something honest is finally being said. Frightening, because change implies uncertainty. This is where grief often appears. Grief for the years spent surviving instead of living. Grief for the self that learned to be strong too early. Grief for the version of life that was promised but never quite arrived. But grief here isn't regression, it's integration. It's the mind recognizing that endurance alone was never meant to be the destination. At this stage, people often notice something subtle but important. The exhaustion doesn't feel as hostile. It still exists, but it no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a messenger that's been ignored for too long. Instead of demanding immediate solutions, the mind becomes curious. What if rest didn't have to be earned? What if worth wasn't conditional? What if slowing down wasn't the same as falling behind? These questions don't need immediate answers. Their power lies in opening space. For the first time, the future isn't imagined as more of the same. It becomes undefined, and that uncertainty, while uncomfortable, holds possibility. This is the moment when people stop trying to fix themselves and start considering how to live differently. Not better, not harder, just more honestly. The subtle shift isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes the direction of the story. Because once the exhaustion is understood as a message, ignoring it is no longer an option. And something inside begins to believe, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that staying might not require so much pain. Healing, in this context, doesn't arrive as a sudden surge of motivation. It arrives as permission. Permission to live at a pace the nervous system can tolerate. Permission to stop performing strength. Permission to exist without constantly proving worth. For people who are tired of existing, staying is not about endurance anymore. It's about redesign. The first shift often happens in the body, not the mind. Learning to notice tension, to recognize when the breath is shallow, to pause before pushing past limits. This is nervous system repair, small moments of safety, repeated consistently. Rest becomes intentional, not stolen. Not collapse after burnout, but gentle, proactive care. This might look like fewer commitments, longer pauses between tasks, allowing silence without filling it. At first, this feels uncomfortable. For those who equated worth with productivity, stillness can trigger guilt or anxiety. But over time, the body learns something new. Nothing bad happens when I slow down. Boundaries become another form of healing. Not walls, but filters. Choosing what deserves energy and what doesn't. Saying no without explanation. Letting some expectations fall unmet. This isn't selfishness. It's sustainability. Emotionally, healing means allowing feelings to move again. Not forcing positivity. Not rushing toward solutions, but letting sadness, frustration, and grief exist without judgment. Paradoxically, this makes space for joy to return. Not in fireworks, but in quiet, ordinary moments. A warm drink, a song that lands differently, a morning without urgency. Purpose also begins to shift. Instead of chasing meaning as a grand concept, people start finding it in presence. In moments that feel true rather than impressive. They stop asking, "What should I be doing with my life?" and start asking, "What feels manageable, honest, alive today?" Healing here is not about becoming someone new. It's about removing the conditions placed on existence. About unlearning the belief that life must be constantly optimized to be worth staying in. There are setbacks, of course. Old habits resurface under stress. The urge to overfunction returns. But now there's awareness, and awareness creates choice. Instead of spiraling into self-criticism, there's compassion. I'm tired again, that makes sense. I need less right now. I'm allowed to adjust. Over time, the relationship with existence changes. It becomes less adversarial. Life is no longer something to survive or conquer. It becomes something to negotiate with gently. Learning to stay doesn't mean loving every day. It means building a life that doesn't require constant self-betrayal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the thought, "I don't want to exist," is replaced with something softer. I can stay, as long as I don't abandon myself again. There is a quiet courage in staying, especially when no one sees the effort it takes. Not the kind of staying that grits its teeth and endures, but the kind that breathes, adjusts, and chooses presence, even when it feels heavy. For those who have been tired of existing, being here was never about optimism. It was about persistence, sometimes gentle, sometimes exhausted, sometimes unsure why it continued at all. And yet it did. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because something inside learned that existence doesn't have to be earned through suffering. There is no final transformation in this story. No permanent arrival at peace. Just a quieter relationship with being alive. Some days still feel weighty. Some mornings still begin with reluctance. But now, there is less self-betrayal in those moments. The question is no longer, can I keep doing this forever? But, what do I need today to stay? And sometimes the answer is rest. Sometimes it's distance. Sometimes it's connection. Sometimes it's simply permission to not try so hard. Staying becomes less dramatic, more human. It looks like choosing softer edges. Letting go of narratives that demand constant growth. Allowing life to be uneven, unfinished, imperfect. There is dignity in this kind of presence. Not the loud resilience that's applauded, but the quiet resilience that adapts. The kind that learns to sit with uncertainty without turning it into self-judgment. For a long time, existence felt like an obligation. Now it becomes a conversation. Some days you lean in, some days you lean away. And that's allowed, because being alive was never meant to feel like a performance. It was meant to feel inhabited. And if you're still here, not thriving, not fixed, not overflowing with gratitude, just here, that is not failure. That is a tired mind choosing to remain on its own terms. And sometimes that is more than enough.